Our next set of tools in our toolbar are pretty much our brush tools. We've got a lot of neat different tools in here. I'll kind of show you what they do. Our first one that we have up here is our spot healing brush. And if we hold down that with the left mouse button, we can also see we have the healing brush tool, the patch tool, and the red eye tool. With the spot healing brush, it's really neat because what we can do is draw in and paint in a certain spot, and what it'll do is it'll gather information from around that area and try to blend it together. So you can see it really removed that red and started to blend the colors in. Of course, we want to make this a little bit larger, so I'm going to create a larger brush here and really go in and kind of show that. And you can see it really blends that color together and it removes that area. We can, of course, adjust the hardness so that it's a much softer edge around this area. But it'll just grab information from around that source and sort of try to blend it together. And it doesn't always work with certain images. This is good for retouching faces, blemishes, things like that when you're working on model photography. There's also other little bits you can do with it, removing objects, and it can actually be a very efficient tool. Another variation of this tool is the healing brush tool, which allows you to actually sample the area where you want the color to be coming from. So what I can do is hold down Alt and click on this sort of dark area down here, which actually be a lake that's in the shot that's very dark, and then paint in above that area, and then it sort of blends those two together. So that's a way of defining a specific area without it just grabbing the information from around it. And then we also have the patch tool, which what we can do is actually draw out an area that we want to be copied from another area, and then we can sort of move that around. Of course, that wasn't drawn out very well, and then it'll blend those together. So that's kind of a neat tool as well. And then we can right mouse click and of course get other options. We can use patch as source or as destination, so we can swap those back and forth. And we can also use patterns that are predefined within Photoshop to sort of create those areas. Our next tool is our different types of actual painting brush tools. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. Oops, sorry. I clicked the wrong thing there. I'm going to go to New Layer, click OK. And I'm going to actually paint this a flat color, just so we can see these brush strokes that are being created over on top of this image on another layer. And I'm going to create one more and change our color by clicking on this and grabbing sort of a bright red, so it's a nice contrasting color. But with our brush tool, we can right mouse click and get all of our different brush options, and that's how I've been pulling that up. We can change the diameter, and this is based off a basic brush. If you're just going to be using typical brushes, you can just select one of these and then edit the diameter, making it larger and larger, pretty much as large as 2500 pixels. So that's pretty neat. And then we can adjust the hardness, so how soft the edges are. So let's go ahead and just sort of paint in here. We can see with that large brush, it obviously created a very large red area. So let's make that a little smaller, and we'll make our hardness 100%, so we can see it's a very fine line, and that really stands out. But of course, adjust the hardness down a lot lower, so it's very soft. But of course, the softness really depends on the size of the brush as well. So you'll learn to really paint and kind of figure things out. We also, like I said, we have all these different brush types in here. We can grab different colors and paint those in and get different types of effects, and all that you can go ahead and change. We'll be really taking a look at that within the brush settings, and actually being able to edit our brushes and create very specific effects that we want. The next is the pencil tool, which is a pretty much direct pixel painting tool. In other words, it creates very, very sharp lines. I'm going to just zoom in here to the pixel level so we can actually see the pixels, and just draw in here with the pencil tool. We can see that it's not anti-aliased at all, and then we can still adjust our brush size, but it's going to create a very sharp edge around something. So if you need to create sort of alpha maps for a program, if you're working in 3D at all, you're creating alpha clip maps, even with masks working within Photoshop, you might need a very sharp line, because there's a big difference between our brush tool at 100% hardness and of course our pencil tool. And I'm going to change that brush so we can actually see So it's a flat brush. And we can see the difference. I'll just paint them next to each other and zoom in. And we can see the difference between the brush and the pencil tool. Pencil tool is very sharp. There's no anti-aliasing on the edges. And with the brush tool, we have a nice soft blend between the two colors, which looks a lot better. But it really depends on what it is you're working on. And then we also have our color replacement tool, which we can select a specific color and, of course, change it. And I'll get into that tool a little bit later. So go ahead and just delete this layer I just created. And let's take a look at our next tool. I'm going to actually hide this layer, which we can do by clicking on this little box over here, which is going to show the eye either on or off, or either there or not there. So we can work on other layers without certain layers getting in the way if we want to remove them. And we're going to take a look at the clone stamp tool now. We also have a pattern stamp tool. If we hold down the left mouse button, I'm going to right mouse click, make this a little bit larger. What the clone stamp tool does is very similar to sort of the patch tool or the healing brush, where we select an area and it clones it, but in this case it won't blend them together. So if I hold on Alt and select the sun and then start brushing down here, we can see that it copies the exact part of the image to the bottom, and it's just copying that predefined area. So with no blending afterwards, so it's a very direct effect. So if we want to have two of these right next to each other, we could use this tool for that, or even three. We could define the area again and then go around. There's also other major settings for this, and that is whether you want it to be aligned or not aligned. In other words, let's take a look and actually see an example of that. If I go ahead and hold down Alt and click in the center of the sun, and now start painting over here, and then let go of the mouse and unclick without it clicked, and since we have a line down, what I can actually do is pick up where I left off and start continuing working down throughout the image. Now I'm going to go back and delete those clones, and let's take a look at with aligned off. I'm going to select that layer because when we go back in the history, it also determines which layer is selected, and because that's back in the history before I selected this layer, those actual layer selections do not show up in the history. So you do need to change. So if you see this little sign up here, it says we pretty much can't do anything. You gotta select the right layer. Okay, so I'm going to hold down Alt and click in the sun again, and now I'm going to start copying on the side, and I'm going to let go of the mouse and come down here to the bottom and click again, and as you can see, it doesn't start up where we left off last time, and what it actually does is keeps cloning from that same area every single time. So depending on what you're doing, you might need to use aligned, or you might not need to use align. We also have the ability to adjust our flow, so pretty much how intense and how long it takes to go over that image before it's complete opacity. And we can also adjust the opacity level so it's very dim, and you can see it's just kind of painting over these black areas that is just extremely dim. So there's a lot of different things you can do. This is also basic tools for just any brush mode. If we go to our brushes, we can see we can adjust the opacity and the flow. And we also have the Airbrush Style. We can either enable that or disable that. And pretty much what that is, if you're not using a stylus, if you're using a sort of a stylus pad as your mouse, what you can do is just press down harder to get larger amounts of a brush. But if you're actually, let's go ahead and actually lower the opacity to show this. But if you're using a mouse, you're going to have to hold down and just keep holding it down for that flow to catch up the opacity, and that's pretty much the Airbrush Style. But that really only affects pen tools and tablets for the most part, and those are most efficient, of course, with those tools if you have those available. I'm going to go back and sort of deselect this, where we've gone back way beyond our layers creation. Another thing we have is our pattern stamp tool, which allows us to just select a pattern that's preset loaded, and we can just paint that in. So we can paint patterns in over. You can create your own patterns if you want to. Going up here, new pattern. We can select some of the presets that we have. Color paper, append. and then add those in. So now we have some more patterns that we could paint in. I could also go in and select our rock patterns, append, so that it adds to our library, and we can paint those in. So that's a neat little tool we can do. And patterns come in handy and also show up in Photoshop quite a bit. So there's quite a few places you'll find that you'll be able to use them. Let's change this back to the clone stamp. And then we have our history and art history brush, which I'll go into. But pretty much what we can do is actually paint back in previous layers. And since I don't really have any states back earlier, I'll show you that in a little bit. But what we can actually do is adjust and paint our image from a previous state to the current state and sort of blend in between the two with that brush tool. So that's kind of a neat thing we can do. The next thing we have underneath that is our eraser tool, which is pretty much self-explanatory. We also have the background eraser tool and the magic eraser tool. And the magic eraser tool, I'll just start that first. That works just like the magic wand tool does, except it erases the area. So if I go ahead and click and that's set under the sun, and now instead of selecting it, it erases it. I prefer using the selection tool because that way you can see it before you can just click delete and erase it. So it pretty much does the same thing, but we can go ahead in here and just see how that tool works, and it'll just erase large areas. For quick work, it's a good tool. Otherwise, I would suggest using the magic wand tool because then you can see the area you're about to delete before you actually delete it. Instead of having to go back into the history, we can just deselect. The next one is the background eraser tool, and this is going to erase, of course, the background, but we don't really have many layers on here, so that's really not going to show up just yet. I'll show you that. But then we have our basic eraser tool, which works. We can actually select just like the brushes. It's the same exact presets, and all we really got to do is I'm just going to select an interesting looking brush in here, and what we can do is just delete areas of the image or any layer that we're working on, and of course just these settings, just like we would with any other brush, and it works just like a standard brush, except it's actually erasing the image instead of painting on it. Next is our fill, and this is our paint bucket tool. And what I can actually do is I'm going to select green. I'm going to click in this white area, and it's going to paint in that area. So this is also similar to the magic wand tool, except instead of selecting an area or even like the magic eraser tool where we're deleting an area, we're painting it in. And it's using pretty much the same technology and algorithms to detect which areas need to be filled and which ones don't. We can also adjust the tolerance, just like we could with other things. So I can change our tolerance to 100. And let's click in there, and now we can see that we've painted a much larger area. And if we know we only want exact colors, we can of course adjust that to 0, paint that, and it's just going to do whatever area is almost exactly white or whatever we select. So if I come up here, it's just going to do one little pixel. It's not going to do very much. We can also adjust the opacity within there. If we wanted to, turn off anti-aliasing, and of course change our blending modes, which we'll get into once I start discussing the layers panel, because blending modes are also very important, but require a little bit of explanation. Along with our paint bucket tool is also the gradient tool. The gradient tool allows us to create a gradient across an image. I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer, and now with our default colors down here, I can actually select our original black and white colors just by clicking this lower left part. Resets us to a black to a white. Now we have different types of gradients. On the top here we just have a straight gradient, and I'm going to click and continue holding down, and what it's going to do is draw out where we want the gradient to go. The first click is the first color, and the second click, this other bar on the right side, is the other color. So that's the bottom color is the background color and the white, and then the foreground color is the black right here. So we can create gradients that way just by drawing out these certain areas, and then depending on how thick that bar is we can create much larger gradients and get a nice look across the image. We also have other different shapes. We can select the second shape up here, which is going to give us a round gradient, and we can work with this both ways to get different types of effects and a different shape gradient. And then we also have another one here, which will give us a nice angle starting from one color and then rotating around to another. And then of course our horizontal or vertical gradient, which is pretty much a mirrored gradient. So it's just like the first one, except it mirrors that image down the center. And then we have sort of our star shape or a diamond shaped gradient that we can go ahead and create anything we want out of that. This also has blending modes, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later because there's different types of effects we can do by using gradients. And as you can see, I can overlay certain gradients on other ones by using different blending modes. So there's a lot we can do with blending modes, and I'll really get into that a little bit later. I'm going to set that to normal. Let's take a look at the presets. If we click up here, we can select some of the preset gradients that are already loaded within Photoshop. Or if we go ahead and just click on that, we can get our gradient editor and create our own within the editor. So there's a lot we can do. We can move this out to the side, select our color. We could go ahead and add new keyframes, or not so much keyframes, but new colors in here for our gradient. I'm going to click OK, and now we can edit that new gradient that we have. Click on the gradient again, we can go back and adjust that. Clicking on the bottom here will create new colors and new swatches we can add in. And of course, just the blending on that. We can change the location by actual percentage, or we can just drag it in. There's lots of stuff we can do. We can also adjust the middle control, so how far the gradient goes in there without having to create other little keys on the bottom there. And we can also adjust the smoothness of the overall gradient, which we can see, and then whether it's a noise gradient, because the noise gradient will look a lot different. See, it's much more noise, or just a smooth one. So there's a lot we can do with the gradient tool, and you get some really neat effects once you start using different blending modes. So as you can see, with the a certain blending mode, we can get that kind of effect and keep overlaying it. Okay, let's look at the next one, which is actually I'm going to get rid of that layer, just turn that off for right now, and we're going to take a look. We have the smudge, the sharpen, and the blur tool. The smudge tool will allow us to just smudge our image, just like if we were putting our finger to a wet canvas with paint and just kind of smudging that out of the way. So this pretty much explains itself. We can adjust the strength of this, so we can get a very large smudge from that area, or we can bring it down very low so it's a very small amount. Okay, our next one is the Sharpen tool, which will allow us to sharpen up our edges. And because of this type of image, it's looking really grainy, and of course this is at 50%, so but if you have just small areas you need to sharpen up, and you just want to touch up the whole area without using, of course, a sharpen filter, which we easily could use, this allows us to use the brush. And the next one is the blur tool. So we can actually go in and define a certain area to blur by using a paintbrush, which we have set up as our defaults, or anything you add in there. So there's a lot you can do with it. I'm going to go back to our earlier state. And now let's take a look at our next tool, which is our dodge tool, burn tool, and sponge tool. The dodge tool will allow us to adjust either shadows, midtones, or highlights. And let's take a look at highlights and what it does to highlights. What it's doing is brightening up the highlights. And what we can do is go to shadows, and it's going to brighten up our shadows. So the dodge tool is going to brighten up any area you select it to brighten up. So the dark areas are shadows, and then we have our midtones, which will also lighten up. And of course we can adjust the exposure and whether or not we're using a stylus or we want that sort of effect on it. The burn tool is the exact opposite. It will darken areas. So if we go to highlights, what we can do is darken those highlights by using the burn tool. We can of course adjust our exposure just like we did with the other tool. And then the last one is our sponge tool. And that's going to give us an entirely different type of effect where we can desaturate or saturate. Desaturation will remove all color. So if I select desaturate on this right side, we're seeing that we're moving the color, and since the flow is only at 50, I'll bring that to 100%, and now we can see it's completely black and white on this side. If we go to saturate, on the left side, you can see it intensifies the colors that are in there. If I go to the right, it sort of brings up the colors we missed, but it will not color a desaturated image or a black and white image. But what it does is intensifies or decreases the amount of color and saturation that you have within your image.